Here's something that should bother you. The Jesus you were taught to follow might not be the only Jesus who ever spoke. Somewhere in the Egyptian desert, sealed inside a clay jar and buried for over 1,000 years, there were words attributed directly to him. Not stories about him, not a sermon written by someone else decades later, trying to remember what he might have meant. His own sayings. And almost nobody alive today has actually read them. I want to show you what was inside that jar. And I want you to understand why, once you know, you might never hear the name Jesus the same way again. This isn't about tearing anything down. I'm not here to take your faith and throw it in the trash. I'm here because I think the full story is more interesting, more human, and honestly more empowering than the edited version most of us were handed. Stay with me. This gets strange fast. Before there was one official version of Jesus, there were competing memories of him. Different communities, different followers, each one carrying pieces of what he said, arguing quietly over what it meant. I remember the first time I read his words outside the Bible. It didn't feel like theology. It felt like someone talking straight to me, cutting through centuries, asking me a question I wasn't ready for. What you were taught, whatever version of religious education touched your life, was one version. A winning version. Not because it was the only one that existed. Because it was the one that survived the fight. You were handed the ending. Nobody showed you the other drafts. And I get why. It's easier to teach one clean story than a messy pile of competing ones. But easier isn't the same as complete. Somewhere along the way, entire communities of people who genuinely believed they understood Jesus were quietly written out of the record, their books labeled dangerous, their names attached to the word heresy. I don't think that makes them right about everything, but I do think it makes them worth listening to. It's 1945, near a cliff called Jabal al-Tarif in Upper Egypt. A farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Salman is digging in the soil, hunting for a soft, nitrogen-rich fertilizer called sabak. His hoe hits something hard. Not a rock, something sealed. He clears the dirt and pulls out a large clay jar, still intact after more than 1,000 years underground. Picture the weight of it in his hands, the dust still clinging to the clay, the sun beating down on a cliff that has kept this secret since before his grandfather's grandfather was born. And here's the part that gets me every time I think about it. He almost doesn't open it. Local stories say jars like this can hold a spirit trapped inside, waiting. He hesitates, standing there in the heat, weighing fear against curiosity. But the hope of gold wins over the fear. He smashes it open. There's no gold. Instead, there are 13 leather-bound books, pages made of papyrus, wrapped and hidden by people who clearly wanted them protected. Protected or silenced. Maybe both at once. What happens next should make your stomach turn a little. Before anyone understands what they're holding, some of the pages get burned for kindling. Sit with that for a second. Words possibly spoken by Jesus in a cooking fire, because nobody in that moment knew what they were destroying. It takes years before scholars grasp the full weight of what survived. And what survived includes something called the Gospel of Thomas. This is where the real story starts. Because Thomas isn't a narrative. It doesn't describe a birth, a miracle, a trial. It's a list. A collection of sayings credited to Jesus, spoken to people close to him. No plot. No crucifixion scene. Just his voice, stripped down to lines meant to be sat with, not simply read. Let me walk you through a few of them, in plain language, the way I first understood them. In one saying, Jesus tells the people around him that the kingdom they're searching for isn't somewhere in the sky, waiting for them after death. It's already spread out across the earth, in front of them, and most people simply don't see it. Read that again. Not a reward you earn later. Something already here that you're missing. In another, he tells someone that if they bring forth what is inside them, it will save them. And if they don't, what stays buried inside will destroy them. That's not comfortable. That's not the version you probably heard as a kid, wrapped in a bough, easy to sit through once a week. This sounds like someone shaking you by the shoulders, not someone reading you a bedtime story. There's another line where Jesus tells his followers not to lie, and not to do what they hate. Simple on the surface, but sit with it. He's not handing them a list of rules imposed from outside. He's pointing them back toward their own conscience, as if the real authority was never meant to live in a building or a title. It was meant to live in you. Elaine Pagels, a religious historian who spent decades studying these buried texts, helped bring writings like this into the mainstream. She's one of the reasons the wider world even knows this material exists. And when you read her work, you start to notice something. These sayings don't read like propaganda for an institution. They read like someone trying to wake people up, not recruit them. Here's what I take from these words, and I'll admit this part is personal. If the kingdom is already here, already inside a person, then maybe what he was pointing to wasn't a future reward. Maybe it was a forgotten identity. The idea underneath all of it is this: a piece of the divine already lives inside you. Not something to be earned through decades of good behavior. Something already present, buried under noise, fear, and forgetting. That completely changes what sin would even mean. Not a crime you commit against a distant judge. Closer to a kind of amnesia. You forgot what you are, and you started living like you were only the smallest version of yourself. I find that more compassionate than the version I grew up hearing. Less about punishment, more about waking up. And maybe that's exactly why it makes some people uncomfortable. A God who threatens punishment needs to be feared and obeyed. A spark that's already inside you just needs to be remembered. One of those keeps you dependent. The other one sets you free the moment you actually believe it. There's a second thread running through these sayings, and it's the one that makes people nervous even now. Over and over, the emphasis isn't on believing something someone else told you. It's on knowing, directly, for yourself. The Greek word for this kind of knowing is gnosis. Not secondhand information. Not doctrine memorized and repeated. Direct, personal contact with truth. Think about what that actually implies. If the truth already lives inside you, and you can access it directly, you don't need someone standing between you and it. No middleman required. That's a quiet kind of danger. Not violent, not loud. Just the suggestion that a person might not need permission to know what's real. And that idea alone was enough to make certain people in power very uncomfortable. I think about this a lot, honestly. Most of us were trained, somewhere along the way, to distrust our own inner knowing and outsource it to someone louder, more official, more credentialed. Gnosis pushes back against that training. It says your direct experience actually counts for something. That's not arrogance. That's responsibility, and it's a heavier weight to carry than simply being told what to believe. Now I want to be honest with you about something, because it matters. What I'm about to describe isn't what Jesus is recorded as saying. It's what later thinkers built on top of his words, trying to explain them. Some early Gnostic schools, group scholars now label Valentinian and Sethian, after later teachers and cities associated with them, developed an entire cosmology. They proposed that the physical world wasn't crafted by the ultimate, highest source of all things. Instead, it was shaped by a lesser being, sometimes called the demiurge, a flawed or even blind craftsman who mistook himself for the only God there was. Above him, in their framework, sat something vast and unknowable, the true source, along with a figure called Sophia, representing wisdom, whose fall and longing to return became part of the larger myth. I'm not asking you to accept this as literal truth. I'm showing you the shape of the questions people were asking. If Jesus spoke of a hidden kingdom already inside a person, these later thinkers wanted to know. Hidden from what? And their answer was unsettling. Hidden from a system, a structure, possibly even a lesser authority mistaking itself for the highest one. I'll be honest, this is the part of Gnostic thought that people misunderstand the most, and it's the part that gets Gnosticism unfairly labeled as anti-religious. It isn't an attack on the idea of the sacred. It's a challenge to unquestioned authority, dressed up in mythology because myth was the language available at the time. Strip away the ancient names, and underneath it you'll find a question that still applies today. Who told you that the rules you're following came from the very top? And did you ever actually check? So why did this nearly disappear completely? Not because of some single villain twirling a mustache in a back room. It's simpler and honestly a bit more human than that. As Christianity grew, it needed one coherent story to spread across an empire. Councils of bishops met, argued, and eventually agreed on which texts counted as scripture and which didn't. Texts that emphasized secret, personal knowledge over communal obedience didn't fit neatly into an institution trying to unify millions of people under one structure. Once that decision was made, owning or copying the excluded texts became genuinely dangerous. Historians believe that's likely why someone, probably a monk connected to a nearby monastery, buried those 13 books in a jar instead of destroying them. Not agreement with an official ban. Quiet defiance. A decision to hide the words rather than lose them completely. You don't need a villain to explain this story. You just need power, finding it easier to run one voice than to manage many. Here's why any of this still matters to you right now, today. The core idea, that truth might live inside a person and not require outside permission to access, still unsettles anyone whose authority depends on obedience. Religious structures. political systems, even the algorithms quietly deciding what you're allowed to see and what gets buried from your feed. You felt this before. That moment you were told to stop asking questions and just accept the answer you were given. That small flicker of resistance in your chest when something didn't add up, but you were expected to nod anyway. That flicker is exactly what these buried words were pointing toward, centuries before you were born. The most dangerous sentence in any system built on obedience isn't a rebellion. It's someone quietly saying, "I already know this for myself." I genuinely believe this is why these texts stayed hidden for so long, and honestly, why they still make certain people uneasy today. It was never really about theology. It was about who gets to hold the final word on what's true. A book of secret sayings that tells you to look inward instead of upward doesn't need a bishop, a gatekeeper, or a permission slip. That's not a comfortable idea for any structure built on being needed. For those of you who already sit with esoteric ideas, let's go one layer deeper. Across several Gnostic texts, there's a recurring image of sleep. Humanity isn't described as evil. It's described as asleep, forgetful, wandering through a kind of dream mistaken for reality. Waking up isn't punishment or reward. It's remembering something you already knew before you forgot it. There's also the image of light trapped inside matter, sparks scattered through the physical world, waiting to be recognized and gathered back. And in some of these traditions, the serpent from the garden story isn't simply framed as evil. It's read symbolically as a bringer of knowledge, the disruptor that offers awareness instead of obedience. I'm not telling you to take any of this literally. I'm telling you these are symbols, ancient language reaching for something that's hard to say plainly. Sleep, light, memory, waking. That's the vocabulary underneath the myth. What strikes me most is how consistent this pattern is across cultures that never even spoke to each other. Forgetting and remembering, sleeping and waking. Darkness holding a spark of light that refuses to go out completely. When the same symbol keeps showing up in wildly different places across centuries, it's usually not a coincidence. It's usually pointing at something real about the human condition, dressed in whatever language that particular culture had available. I think you felt this too, even if you never had words for it. That moment where you knew you were more than your circumstances. More than the job title, the mistakes, the label someone else handed you. A flicker underneath all of it that felt older than your fear, steadier than your doubt. Maybe that's what he was actually pointing to. Not a threat waiting for you after death. An invitation happening right now, in this exact moment, to stop sleepwalking through your own life. That's not comfortable to sit with. It wasn't meant to be. It was meant to wake you up. Go back with me one last time, to that cliff in Egypt. A farmer, a hoe, a jar sealed for over 1,000 years, nearly burned before anyone understood what was inside it. What almost got lost wasn't just an old book. It was a reminder that the truth doesn't always survive because it's protected by the powerful. Sometimes it survives because one person, afraid, quietly chose to bury it instead of destroy it. So here's the question I'll leave you with. What have you buried inside yourself, out of fear, that's still waiting to be dug back up? If this pulled you in, stay a while longer. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of digging. And tell me in the comments, what part of this actually shook you?